Hello and welcome. Tonight we journey to a small village in Georgian England to a June afternoon in 1763 when a paralyzed man sitting in a chair outside his cottage vanished in the span of 15 minutes and was never seen again. Picture a cobblestone lane in Shepton Mallet, Somerset, where everyone knows everyone and strangers are immediately noticed. Imagine an elderly man who cannot walk, cannot stand, cannot move from his chair without assistance, sitting in the warm summer sun while his sister steps inside the cottage for a brief moment. And then imagine returning to find the chair empty, the man gone, no sound of struggle, no witnesses, no explanation. This is not a story of someone who wandered off and got lost. This is the story of a man who was physically incapable of moving himself, who disappeared in broad daylight from a populated village where any unusual activity would have been seen and remembered. For more than 260 years, people have tried to explain what happened to Owen Parfitt. Every theory has been proposed, from the criminal to the miraculous to the supernatural. But every theory encounters the same fundamental problem. A paralyzed man cannot simply vanish. Yet that is precisely what Owen Parfitt did. This is his story. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep explorations of historical mysteries, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you find yourself drifting off during this story, that's exactly what this content is designed for. A slow, detailed journey into the past that helps your mind settle into rest. Now, let's explore the mystery of Owen Parfitt. To understand the impossibility of what happened to Owen Parfitt, we must first understand the world he lived in. The year 1763 was deep in the Georgian era of England, when George III had been king for just 3 years, and the country was emerging from the 7 Years' War. But in the rural villages of Somerset, life continued much as it had for centuries. The grand events of London and the larger world felt distant and abstract. What mattered was the harvest, the weather, the health of livestock, and the rhythms of village life that had sustained communities since medieval times. Shepton Mallet was an ancient market town in Somerset, about 20 miles south of Bath. Picture narrow lanes winding between stone cottages, their walls built from the same golden limestone that had been quarried locally for hundreds of years. Thatched roofs or slate tiles kept out the rain. Small windows with leaded glass panes let in what light they could. Smoke rose from chimneys where wood fires burned for cooking and heating. The town centered around its market square and the magnificent church of St. Peter and St. Paul, whose tower dominated the skyline and whose bells marked the hours for a population that largely couldn't read clocks. The population of Shepton Mallet in 1763 numbered perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 souls. Imagine a community where anonymity was impossible. Everyone knew their neighbours, knew their families, knew their business and their troubles. A stranger arriving in town would be noticed immediately, remarked upon, discussed. Children playing in the lanes would run to tell their mothers that an unfamiliar face had appeared. This was not a place where things could happen secretly. The very smallness and closeness of the community is what makes Owen Parfitt's disappearance so baffling. Daily life in Georgian rural England followed patterns established over centuries. People rose with the sun because candles and oil were expensive. They worked through the daylight hours at whatever trade or farming occupied them. As evening fell, they returned to their cottages, ate their simple meals, and went to bed soon after dark. There was no street lighting, no public illumination beyond what individual households provided. Night meant darkness nearly absolute, broken only by the moon and stars when weather permitted. Transportation in 1763 was limited to what it had been for centuries: walking, riding horses, or using carts pulled by horses or oxen. The roads between towns were often little more than rutted dirt tracks, impassable in winter, dusty in summer. Moving anything heavy required significant effort and planning. A wagon needed to be obtained, horses or oxen hitched, the load secured. It wasn't something that could be done quickly or quietly, and within a village like Shepton Mallet, nearly everyone travelled on foot. The sound of hooves or cartwheels on cobblestones would echo through narrow lanes, how neighbours would look out their windows to see who was passing. The medical knowledge of the era was primitive by modern standards, though physicians and surgeons did what they could with the understanding available to them. Paralysis was known by the term palsy and was recognised as a serious affliction usually caused by apoplexy, what we now call stroke, or by injury to the spine. The causes were poorly understood, but the effects were clear. Loss of movement, loss of feeling, complete dependence on others for care. There was no treatment. A person who became paralyzed remained paralyzed. The medical literature of the time occasionally mentioned cases of sudden or partial recovery, but complete recovery from total paralysis was considered essentially impossible, particularly in an elderly person. Life for a paralyzed person in 1763 meant total dependence. Picture what it meant to be unable to move yourself from bed, unable to stand, unable to walk. Every aspect of life required assistance: eating, drinking, attending to bodily functions, changing position to avoid bed sores. For poor or working-class families, caring for a paralyzed member was an enormous burden. There were no nurses, no care facilities, no government assistance. The family simply did what needed to be done, or the person died. It was a harder, more brutal world than ours, where survival often depended on physical capability, and those who lost that capability survived only through the devotion of others. Into this world, Owen Parfitt had been born sometime around the turn of the 18th century. The exact date of his birth is lost to history, but by 1763 he was an elderly man, probably in his 60s or 70s. He had lived his entire life in Somerset, probably in or near Shepton Mallet. He had never married, or if he had, his wife had died long before, leaving no record. By the time his paralysis struck, he was living with his sister, a woman named Susanna, who was herself elderly. What Owen's life had been like before his paralysis, we can only imagine based on what was typical for men of his time and class. He likely worked as a labourer, perhaps in the wool trade that was important in Somerset, or as a farm worker, or in some other manual occupation. Picture a young Owen walking to work each morning, strong and capable, making his living through the labour of his body. He would have known physical exhaustion, long days of work, the satisfaction of a task completed, and wages earned. He would have drunk ale at the local tavern, attended church on Sundays, participated in the life of his community. But then, at some point in the years before 1763, Owen suffered whatever event caused his paralysis. Perhaps it was a stroke, sudden and devastating. Perhaps it was an injury, a fall or accident that damaged his spine. The records don't tell us. What they do tell us is that by the time of his disappearance, Owen Parfitt had been paralyzed for several years. He could not walk. He could not stand. He could not move himself from one position to another. He was completely dependent on his sister Susanna for every aspect of his care. Susanna herself was no young woman. Imagine an elderly woman, probably in her 60s, caring day after day for her paralyzed brother. The physical demands would have been enormous. Getting Owen from his bed each morning would require lifting or dragging his dead weight, feeding him, cleaning him, attending to all his needs throughout the day. At night, getting him back to bed again. And all of this without the benefit of modern aids or equipment. No wheelchair, no hospital bed that could be adjusted, no mechanical lifts, just an elderly woman and her strength and determination. Yet by all accounts, Susanna bore this burden with devotion. There's no record of her complaining or seeking to be relieved of the responsibility. Owen was her brother, and caring for him was simply what she did. In this we see something of the character of both of them. Owen, helpless and dependent. apparently accepted his condition with such grace as he could muster. Susanna, burdened but devoted, provided care without resentment. Picture their daily life, the quiet routines, the small conversations, the shared memories of the decades before paralysis transformed everything. Most days, Owen remained inside the cottage. Moving him was simply too difficult to do more than necessary. He would lie in bed or sit in a chair near the fire, watching the patterns of light change as the sun moved across the sky, listening to the sounds of village life outside, footsteps on cobblestones, voices calling to one another, the bells of the church marking the hours. His world had shrunk to the walls of the cottage and whatever he could see through the windows. For a man who had once walked freely through the countryside, who had known physical strength and independence, it must have been a kind of imprisonment. But on warm summer days, Susanna would sometimes undertake the considerable effort required to bring Owen outside. This was a special treat, a break in the monotony of indoor confinement. Picture the preparation. Susanna would need to gather help, perhaps a neighbour or two, to lift Owen from his chair inside and carry him through the door. Or perhaps she had developed techniques for moving him herself, dragging and manoeuvring his weight inch by inch. However it was accomplished, it required significant effort and time. But once outside, Owen could feel the sun on his face, breathe the fresh air, see the sky and the cottages and the people passing by. For a man in his condition, these were treasures. On these occasions, Owen would be settled in a sturdy wooden chair placed outside the cottage door or beside the street where he could watch village life. The chair needed to be strong enough to support his weight and positioned so that he wouldn't fall. Perhaps blankets were arranged to keep him comfortable. Once settled, Owen would sit quietly, unable to move but content to observe. Neighbours passing by would greet him, exchange a few words perhaps, and move on about their business. Everyone in the village knew Owen Parfitt. Everyone knew his condition. His presence in the chair outside his cottage was a familiar sight, unremarkable in its regularity. Just old Owen, getting some sun, as he sometimes did when the weather was fine. This, then, was the situation on a particular day in June 1763. The exact date is lost to history. The records that survive mention only the month and year. But we can picture the day, summer sunshine warming the Somerset countryside, the sky perhaps dotted with fair weather clouds, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of growing things. It was a day like many others, distinguished by nothing in particular except what was about to happen. Susanna had decided that the weather was fine enough to bring Owen outside. Perhaps she had help from a neighbour to move him, or perhaps she managed it herself through practiced technique and determined effort. However it was accomplished, Owen was carried from inside the cottage and settled in his chair outside. Picture the physical reality of this. An elderly woman, and possibly one other person, lifting or dragging a grown man's dead weight through a doorway, positioning him in a wooden chair, arranging him so he wouldn't slide or fall, perhaps covering him with a blanket despite the summer warmth, because his immobility meant he couldn't warm himself through movement. Owen was positioned where he could see the lane and the cottages opposite, where neighbours passing by would see him and perhaps stop to exchange greetings. The location was visible from the cottage windows, so Susanna could glance out periodically to ensure he was all right. Everything was as it had been on previous occasions when Owen sat outside. There was no reason to expect this day would be different from any other. For some time, Owen sat in his chair while Susanna went about her household tasks. She was nearby, moving in and out of the cottage, visible and audible should Owen need anything. Picture Owen's perspective, unable to move his head easily, looking out at whatever his position allowed him to see. Perhaps he watched clouds drift across the sky. Perhaps he saw neighbours walking past, going about their errands. Perhaps children played in the lane, their voices reaching him. The world went on around him while he sat still, patient in his immobility, because he had no choice but patience. At some point in the early afternoon, the exact time is not recorded, but was probably between 2 and 3 o'clock, Susanna went inside the cottage to attend to some task. The records suggest it was something ordinary, perhaps preparing food or tending to some household chore. Whatever it was, it required her to be inside and occupied for a period of time. She could not see Owen from where she was working, but she was not concerned. Owen was secure in his chair. He could not move. There was nothing to worry about. How long Susanna was inside has been reported differently by different sources, but most accounts agree it was approximately 15 minutes. Some say it might have been slightly longer, perhaps 20 minutes. But it was not hours. It was not even half an hour. Picture this span of time, long enough to complete a simple task, to prepare something, to organize something, but not long enough for anything complex. 15 minutes is the time it takes to boil water for tea, to sweep a floor, to fold linens. It is a brief period, easily accounted for, quickly passed. During those 15 minutes, something impossible happened. When Susanna emerged from the cottage to check on her brother, the chair was empty. Owen was gone. Picture her initial confusion. She must have stood there for a moment, looking at the empty chair, her mind unable to immediately process what she was seeing. Owen couldn't walk. Owen couldn't stand. Owen couldn't move himself. Therefore, Owen must be in the chair. But Owen was not in the chair. The logic of the situation was impossible, yet the evidence of her eyes was undeniable. Perhaps she thought at first that she was mistaken about which chair she'd used, that she was looking at the wrong place. But no, this was the chair, in the exact spot where she'd left him. The blanket that had covered him was there, fallen to the ground or draped over the chair's arm, but Owen himself was gone. Picture her calling his name, the confusion in her voice giving way to alarm. Owen! Owen! But there was no answer. The lane was quiet. The chair was empty. Susanna's next thought must have been that somehow, impossibly, Owen had moved himself. Perhaps he had recovered the use of his legs through some miracle. Perhaps he had dragged himself somewhere. She must have looked around frantically, checking the immediate area around the chair, looking for any sign of him. Could he have somehow crawled inside? She checked the cottage, though how he could have gotten past her without her seeing or hearing, she couldn't explain. But the cottage was empty. Owen was not there. The impossibility of the situation must have been settling on her like a physical weight. Owen could not have moved himself. He had been paralyzed for years. His legs did not work. His body did not obey his will. Even if, through some unprecedented miracle, he had suddenly regained the ability to move, his muscles would have been atrophied from years of disuse. He could not have simply stood up and walked away. Yet he was gone. Someone or something must have taken him. But who? And how? And why? Picture Susanna running to the neighbours, pounding on doors, her voice rising in panic. Owen is gone! He's vanished! He was in his chair, and now he's gone. The neighbours emerged from their cottages, initially sceptical perhaps, thinking there must be some simple explanation. But when they came to see, when they stood before the empty chair and listened to Susanna's account, the impossibility of it struck them too. Owen Parfitt, who could not walk, who could not move, who required assistance for everything, had disappeared in the space of 15 minutes from a chair on a village street in broad daylight, and nobody had seen anything. The search began immediately. Picture neighbours gathering, calling to others, the words spreading rapidly through the small village. Owen Parfitt had vanished. Within an hour, dozens of villagers were searching. They looked in every cottage, every outbuilding, every barn and shed. Someone could have carried him inside somewhere, hidden him. But where? And why? Every building was checked. Every space where a man's body could be concealed was examined. There was no sign of Owen. They searched the lanes and alleys, looking for any indication of where he might have gone or been taken. Perhaps there would be signs of a cart having stopped, marks on the ground, anything that would provide a clue. But the ground was dry, summer hard, and yielded no clear marks. If a cart had been there, if horses had stood nearby, the evidence was not obvious enough to be certain. The search expanded outward from the cottage to the surrounding countryside. Picture dozens of people spreading out across fields and through wooded areas, calling Owen's name, looking behind hedgerows and in ditches. Perhaps he had somehow been moved to a field and left there. Perhaps his body lay somewhere nearby. But the search found nothing. No sign of Owen. No disturbed ground that might indicate a hastily dug grave. No clothing, no possessions, nothing. As the day wore on and the sun began to set, the search took on a more desperate character. Lanterns were lit as darkness fell. Picture the flickering lights moving through the countryside, the voices calling out into the night, the growing realization that they were not going to find him. Not today, perhaps not ever. How could a paralyzed man vanish so completely? Where could he be? The village constable was involved from the beginning, though what he could do beyond organizing the search was unclear. There was no police force as we understand it. Law enforcement in rural Georgian England was informal, consisting of local officials with limited authority and resources. The constable could gather information, could question people, could coordinate the search, but he had no forensic tools, no investigative techniques beyond talking to witnesses and looking for evidence. And the witnesses, such as they were, had nothing useful to report. The constable went door to door, asking everyone who lived near the spot where Owen had sat. Did you see anything unusual? Did you hear anything? Did you notice anyone passing by? Did you see a cart or horses? Did any strangers come through the village? The answers were uniformly negative. Nobody had seen anything. Nobody had heard anything. Nobody had noticed anything unusual at all. It was as if Owen had simply evaporated from his chair. This absence of witnesses is perhaps the most baffling aspect of the entire mystery. Picture the layout of the village. Cottages close together, windows overlooking the lanes, people going about their daily business. Summer afternoon, good weather, people would have been outside. Children playing, women tending gardens, men working. The spot where Owen sat was not isolated. It was in the village, visible from multiple cottages, on a lane where people regularly passed. For someone to approach Owen, to lift or carry him away, to load him onto a cart or carry him off on foot, all of this would have required time and effort. It would have been visible, yet nobody saw anything. Some villagers suggested that perhaps everyone had simply happened to be inside at the crucial moment. Perhaps it was the dinner hour, when families gathered indoors to eat. Perhaps by sheer chance, the lane was empty for those 15 minutes. But others pointed out that even if the lane itself was momentarily empty, people would have heard something. The sound of a cart stopping, of men lifting a body, of Owen himself crying out if he was conscious. Sound carried in the quiet village, yet nobody reported hearing anything unusual. As the search continued over the following days, the theories began to multiply. Some suggested Owen had been murdered, his body carried off and hidden. But why? Owen had no money, no property of value, no enemies that anyone knew of. He was a helpless old man, harmless and pitiable. What reason could anyone have to kill him? And even if someone had, how did they move his body in broad daylight without being seen? Others wondered if Owen had somehow been kidnapped. But again, why? There was no ransom demand. Owen's family had no wealth. He himself was of no value to anyone except his sister who cared for him. And the logistics of kidnapping a paralyzed man from a village street in daylight were nearly impossible to imagine. It would require multiple people, careful planning, exact timing, and extraordinary luck to avoid witnesses. For what purpose would anyone undertake such a risk? Picture the village constable trying to make sense of it all, compiling the statements from Susanna and the neighbours, examining the chair and the area around it, finding nothing that helped explain what had happened. The chair itself was unremarkable. It had not been knocked over or disturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, nothing to indicate violence had occurred. If Owen had fought or resisted being taken, there was no evidence of it. The chair sat as it had, simply empty instead of occupied. The constable examined Susanna's account carefully. She was the only person who knew exactly when Owen had been in the chair and when he had vanished. Her story was straightforward. She had left him in the chair, gone inside for approximately 15 minutes, come back out to find him gone. She had not heard anything unusual during that time. She had been occupied with her task, not paying particular attention to sounds from outside, but she would have noticed if there had been shouting or obvious disturbance. There had been silence, normal silence, and then Owen was gone. Could Susanna herself have been involved? The thought must have occurred to the constable, though he likely dismissed it quickly. Susanna was an elderly woman who had devoted years to caring for her paralyzed brother. What motive could she have to harm him? And even if she had such a motive, she could not physically move Owen's body herself. She would have needed help. And if she had help, that meant conspirators, which meant more people who would need to keep the secret. The more people involved, the less likely a secret could be kept. In a village where everyone knew everyone, a conspiracy would be nearly impossible to maintain. Moreover, Susanna's distress appeared genuine. Picture her in the days after the disappearance, distraught and confused, answering the same questions over and over, unable to provide any explanation that made sense. She had cared for Owen faithfully. She had no reason to harm him. The constable likely concluded that whatever had happened to Owen, Susanna was not responsible for it. As days became weeks and no trace of Owen was found, the active search was eventually abandoned. Picture the gradual acceptance among the villagers that Owen Parfitt was simply gone. They had searched everywhere. They had asked everyone. They had examined every possibility they could think of. Owen remained missing. His disappearance remained unexplained. Life in the village had to continue, even with this mystery unresolved. The official record notes the disappearance in the parish registers. Owen Parfitt, vanished June 1763. No death certificate could be issued because no body had been found. No grave could be dug because there was nothing to bury. Owen existed in a strange limbo, clearly gone, probably dead, but with no certainty about any of it. Picture Susanna living out the remainder of her life with this unknowing, every day aware that her brother had simply vanished and she had no explanation to offer herself or anyone else. In the more than 2.5 centuries since Owen Parfitt disappeared, people have proposed numerous theories to explain what happened. Every theory attempts to account for the fundamental impossibility. A paralyzed man vanished in 15 minutes from a public location without witnesses. Some theories are more plausible than others, but all of them encounter significant problems when examined closely. The most obvious explanation, and the one that most people initially reach for, is that Owen was abducted. Someone deliberately took him, carrying him away or loading him onto a cart and removing him from the village. This theory has the advantage of explaining how a paralyzed man could vanish. He couldn't move himself, so someone moved him. The question is who and why and how. Picture the logistics of abducting Owen. He was a grown man, probably not large but still representing considerable dead weight for anyone trying to move him. Lifting him from the chair would require at least 2 people, possibly more. They would need to carry him to wherever they intended to take him, which would mean either carrying him some distance by hand or having a cart nearby. If they used a cart, they would need to lift him into it, secure him so he didn't fall, and then drive away. All of this would take time, would make noise, would be visible to anyone looking. Consider what this would actually involve in practice. Two men approach Owen sitting in his chair. They must lift him, one taking his arms, the other his legs perhaps, or both grasping him around the torso. Owen is dead weight, unable to help in any way. His body would be limp, difficult to control, awkward to manipulate. Imagine the physical strain of lifting an adult man in this condition, the grunting effort required, the need to coordinate movements between the two lifters. And all of this must be done quickly, within those 15 minutes, while also being quiet enough not to attract attention. If the abductors used a cart, it would need to be positioned nearby, close enough that they could carry Owen to it without being seen or heard. Picture a horse and cart standing in a lane in a village, waiting. The horse would need to be kept calm and quiet. The cart would need to have been positioned there earlier or brought there during the 15-minute window. Either way, moving a horse and cart through village streets creates noise. Hoofbeats on cobblestones, the rattle and creak of wheels, the jingle of harness. In the quiet of a summer afternoon, these sounds would carry. They would be noticed. But perhaps the abductors were cleverer than that. Picture them having positioned the cart beforehand on a less travelled lane nearby, out of direct sight of Owen's cottage, but close enough to carry him there quickly. They wait, watching for the moment when Susanna goes inside. As soon as she disappears through the door, they move quickly to Owen, lift him, carry him the short distance to their waiting cart, load him aboard, and depart immediately. If they moved with purpose and speed, and if luck was with them, in terms of no one else being on the streets at that moment, they might accomplish it within 15 minutes. For the abduction theory to work, the abductors would need to time their action precisely for the 15 minutes when Susanna was inside and the lane was empty. This suggests either extraordinary luck or prior knowledge of the household routine. Perhaps the abductors had been watching the cottage, waiting for exactly this opportunity. But watching a cottage without being noticed in a small village is difficult. Strangers are remarked upon. People would remember seeing unfamiliar faces. Perhaps the abductors were not strangers but local people, villagers themselves who would not be noticed hanging about. But this raises the question of motive even more urgently. What reason could any villager have to abduct Owen Parfitt? He was harmless, poor, helpless. There was no ransom to be gained, no revenge to be taken, no advantage to be won. The more local the perpetrators, the less the crime makes sense. Some have suggested that Owen might have been abducted by a press gang. In the 18th century, the Royal Navy often had difficulty recruiting enough sailors and resorted to forcible impressment, essentially kidnapping men to serve aboard ships. Press gangs operated in coastal areas and sometimes inland towns, looking for able-bodied men to seize. But Owen Parfitt was neither able-bodied nor young. He was an elderly, paralyzed man who would be completely useless aboard a ship. No press gang would waste time taking him. The idea is implausible to the point of absurdity. Another variant of the abduction theory suggests body snatchers. In the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a demand for corpses for medical schools, and criminals sometimes met this demand by robbing graves or, more rarely, by murdering people to supply fresh bodies. But body snatchers wanted corpses, not living paralyzed men, and the market for bodies was primarily in large cities with medical schools, not in rural Somerset. Moreover, if someone wanted to murder Owen for his body, why take him from the chair? Why not simply kill him there, or wait for him to die naturally? He was elderly and ill. Death would likely come soon enough. The abduction theory, in all its variants, founders on the question of motive. Picture someone going to the trouble and risk of abducting a paralyzed elderly man in broad daylight from a village street. What could possibly be worth that risk? What could anyone gain from having Owen in their possession? The theory explains how he could have vanished. Someone took him but cannot explain why anyone would. A related theory suggests that Owen was murdered, though not necessarily for any rational motive. Perhaps someone killed him out of mercy, wanting to end his suffering. Perhaps someone killed him for a reason we cannot understand, some personal grievance or insane whim. Once killed, his body was hidden so well that it has never been found. Picture someone approaching Owen as he sat helpless in his chair. He could not defend himself, could not flee, could barely move to resist. If someone wanted to kill him, it would be tragically easy. A blow to the head, a knife to the throat, hands around the neck, any of these could end him. But again, why? And how was the body moved and hidden? The same logistics that make abduction difficult make murder, followed by body disposal, equally difficult. A dead body is heavy and awkward. Moving it requires strength and time. Doing so without being seen requires luck or careful planning. And then, hiding it well enough that 2 centuries of subsequent development, farming, and building have never uncovered, it requires either an extremely good hiding place or destruction of the body. Could the body have been burned? Fire consumes flesh, but bones remain. Even a thorough cremation leaves fragments. Could the body have been buried? But where? The countryside around Shepton Mallet has been walked over, farmed, built upon for centuries. Bodies have a way of being discovered eventually, especially if they're buried shallowly. Could the body have been thrown down a well or into a body of water? Both are possible, but again, wells are eventually cleaned or filled in. Bodies in water typically surface or are discovered by fishermen. The murder theory has the same fundamental problem as the abduction theory. It can explain how Owen might have vanished, but cannot explain why anyone would want to make him vanish. A paralyzed elderly man is not a threat to anyone, not a competitor, not an obstacle. He represents nothing but suffering and helplessness. What reason for murder could possibly exist? Some have suggested that perhaps the motive was not rational. Perhaps someone in the village was insane, acted on impulse or delusion. Picture a mentally disturbed individual seeing Owen sitting helpless in his chair and acting on some incomprehensible urge. But even this requires that the disturbed individual had the physical capability to move Owen and the luck to do so during the precise window when no one was watching. And it requires that this person never confessed, never hinted at what they'd done, never aroused suspicion through their behavior afterward. It's possible, but it requires stacking one unlikely circumstance atop another. Another category of theories proposes that Owen was not taken by others but left on his own. These theories suggest that Owen somehow recovered the ability to move and walked away voluntarily. Picture the scenario: Owen sitting in his chair, and suddenly, inexplicably, the paralysis that had held him for years simply releases. His legs remember how to bear weight. His muscles, atrophied though they might be, find strength. He stands, perhaps unsteadily, and walks away while his sister is inside. He leaves the village, seeking a new life, or simply wandering in confusion. The appeal of this theory is obvious. It explains Owen's disappearance without requiring criminals or conspirators. It suggests Owen found freedom from his paralysis and took it, even if that freedom meant abandoning his sister and the life he knew. It's a hopeful theory, imagining Owen alive and mobile rather than dead and buried. But it faces significant medical obstacles. Paralysis, particularly the complete paralysis Owen apparently experienced, does not simply resolve itself after years. The medical literature contains occasional cases of surprising recovery, but these typically involve partial paralysis, or paralysis of recent onset. A man paralyzed for years, elderly, with atrophied muscles and aged joints, cannot simply stand up and walk away. Even if some miraculous neural recovery occurred, the muscles would not work. The legs would not bear weight. the attempt to stand would result in collapse. Moreover, if Owen had somehow regained mobility, his behavior makes no sense. Picture a man who has been helpless for years, suddenly discovering he can move again. Would his first impulse be to flee without telling anyone? Would he not call out to his sister, share the miracle, seek help in learning to walk again after so long immobile? Why would he vanish into the countryside, leaving behind the one person who had cared for him faithfully? The psychology doesn't fit the scenario. And even if we accept that Owen somehow both recovered mobility and decided to leave, we must then explain why no one saw him. An elderly man, weak and unsteady, walking through the village and out into the countryside would be noticed. People would remember seeing him. He would have been recognized. Yet there were no sightings. No one came forward to say they'd seen Owen Parfitt walking away. In a community where everyone knew everyone, where Owen had been a familiar figure for years, someone should have seen him if he walked through the village. But no one did. The theory of miraculous recovery, appealing though it might be, cannot account for the medical impossibility of sudden healing, the inexplicable behavior of leaving without word, and the complete absence of witnesses to Owen's departure. As weeks turned to months and no trace of Owen was found, the intensity of the search would have diminished. People have to return to their normal lives eventually. Crops need tending, work needs doing, the daily business of survival continues regardless of unsolved mysteries. Picture the village slowly returning to normal, with Owen's disappearance becoming a story people told rather than an active investigation. The chair was likely brought back inside or discarded. Life went on, but the mystery never went away. Over the following years and decades and then centuries, people continued to discuss what had happened to Owen Parfitt. Writers and researchers became interested in the case. Theories multiplied. The disappearance entered the folklore of Somerset and eventually spread beyond, becoming one of those historical mysteries that captures imagination precisely because it seems so impossible. When confronted with an event that seems to defy explanation, human beings naturally generate theories to make sense of what happened. Owen Parfitt's disappearance has generated numerous theories over the past 260 years. Some are prosaic, some are dramatic, some venture into the supernatural. All of them attempt to explain the fundamental mystery. How does a paralyzed man vanish from a chair in the middle of a populated village in 15 minutes, leaving no trace and no witnesses? The first and most obvious theory is that Owen was abducted by criminals. Perhaps someone in the village or a stranger passing through saw an opportunity and took it. But immediately, this theory encounters problems. What opportunity did they see? Owen had nothing of value. He was a paralyzed elderly man living with his elderly sister in what was likely a modest cottage. There was no ransom demand, no note, no attempt to extract money or anything else from Susanna. If the motive was robbery, why take Owen rather than simply entering the cottage when both he and Susanna were elsewhere? And if the motive was something else, some personal grudge or vendetta, there is no record of Owen having any enemies or being involved in any disputes. Consider what would have been required for an abduction. One or more people would need to approach Owen as he sat in his chair. They would need to lift him, no small task given his dead weight and their presumed unfamiliarity with how to carry a paralyzed person. They would need to transport him somewhere, either carrying him or using some conveyance. All of this would need to happen in 15 minutes or less, in a village where people were constantly about, without anyone noticing anything unusual. It strains credulity. Some have suggested that the abduction was carefully planned and executed with precision. Perhaps the criminals had been watching the cottage, knew Susanna's patterns, waited for exactly the right moment when no one happened to be looking in that direction. A group of men waiting in a nearby alley or building, watching for their chance, then moving swiftly when that chance came. They lift Owen from his chair, carry him into the alley or building, and from there transport him away at their leisure, perhaps hidden in a cart or wagon, that had been positioned in advance. This scenario is possible in theory, but it requires a level of planning and coordination that seems improbable for a crime targeting someone with nothing to steal. It would require knowing the layout of the village well enough to identify blind spots where no witnesses would see. It would require timing their move perfectly to coincide with a gap in foot traffic. It would require the physical capability to lift and carry Owen quickly and quietly. And it would require all of this to happen without leaving any evidence or witnesses. The theory is barely plausible, and when we add the question of motive, why would anyone go to such elaborate lengths to abduct Owen Parfitt? It becomes even more problematic. Another variant of the abduction theory suggests that Owen knew his abductor. Perhaps someone approached him, someone familiar and unthreatening, engaged him in conversation to keep him from calling out, and then either persuaded him to go with them or simply seized him when the opportunity arose. A neighbour or acquaintance stopping to chat with Owen, then glancing around to ensure no one was watching, then lifting him and carrying him away. But again, the lack of motive is troubling, and if Owen knew the person, information would likely have emerged during the investigation about who had been seen near the cottage that day. There is also a variant of this theory involving naval press gangs. In 1763, Britain was emerging from the 7 Years' War, and the Navy did sometimes forcibly recruit men for service at sea. Picture a press gang passing through Somerset, desperate for able-bodied men, making the grotesque mistake of seizing Owen despite his obvious paralysis. But this theory falls apart immediately. Press gangs wanted capable sailors, not paralyzed elderly men who would be worse than useless aboard ship. Even the most desperate or incompetent press gang would recognize within seconds that Owen was unsuitable, and if they had somehow taken him by mistake, they would have released or abandoned him almost immediately rather than spiriting him away forever. The criminal abduction theory, in its various forms, fails primarily on the lack of motive and the lack of witnesses. Abductions typically have purposes: ransom, revenge, silencing a witness, removing a rival. None of these apply to Owen, and abductions in populated areas typically leave witnesses or evidence. Someone sees something, something is left behind, some clue emerges. In Owen's case, there is nothing. The abduction theory cannot be entirely ruled out, but it explains very little and raises more questions than it answers. A second major theory is that Owen was murdered by someone who knew him, possibly even by his sister Susanna. This theory posits that Susanna, exhausted by years of caring for her paralyzed brother, decided to end his life and arranged to dispose of his body. Susanna inside the cottage, not doing chores but waiting, steeling herself for what she has decided to do. She emerges when the moment is right, kills Owen quickly, perhaps smothering him with a pillow or cloth, perhaps slitting his throat, perhaps poisoning him then with the help of accomplices or through careful prior planning, disposes of his body where it would never be found. This theory has the advantage of explaining why there were no witnesses to Owen's removal. If Susanna was involved, she could control the narrative. She claimed she was inside for 15 minutes. Perhaps she was actually outside that entire time, accomplishing the murder and disposal. Perhaps she killed him earlier that morning and only staged the outdoor scene to establish an alibi. The lack of evidence makes sense if the person responsible was also the person who controlled access to the scene and was the primary witness. Susanna burying Owen somewhere, perhaps beneath the cottage floor or in a nearby location she could access without suspicion, then returning to discover his chair mysteriously empty and raising the alarm. But this theory has significant problems. First, there is no evidence that Susanna had any motive to murder her brother. By all accounts, she had been caring for him faithfully for years. Caring for a paralyzed person was indeed enormously burdensome, physically demanding and emotionally draining. Imagine the daily exhaustion, the wear on her aging body, the loss of freedom, the relentless need. If Owen had been an unpleasant or demanding patient, if he had been cruel or ungrateful, we might understand a motive building over time, but there is no record of such behaviour. He was described as pleasant despite his condition, accepting of his fate. And, if Susanna had reached a breaking point where she simply could not continue his care, there were other options less risky than murder. In Georgian England, an elderly woman who could no longer care for a paralyzed relative could have sought help from the parish, could have appealed to other family members, could even have simply stopped providing care and let nature take its course, a harsh and grim thought, but one that would have been less criminal than active murder. Picture the parish workhouse, grim and unwelcoming as it was, still an alternative to homicide. If Susanna wanted to be free of her burden, why choose the most dangerous and irreversible option? Second, the disposal of Owen's body would have been enormously difficult for an elderly woman, even with help. Where could she hide a body so thoroughly that extensive searches would never find it? The cottage itself was likely small, probably with earthen or stone floors. Digging a grave large enough for an adult body, especially secretly and quickly, would have been a major undertaking. Picture Susanna, or even Susanna and an accomplice, trying to dig a grave in a cottage floor or in a garden without anyone noticing the fresh-turned earth, without leaving obvious evidence of disturbance. The surrounding area was searched extensively after Owen's disappearance. Gardens, outbuildings, nearby fields, the churchyard, all were examined by people looking for any sign of fresh burial. No such sign was found. Some variants of this theory suggest more elaborate disposal methods. Perhaps Owen's body was burned thoroughly, though this would require sustained heat over hours and would produce smoke and smell that neighbours would notice. Perhaps it was dismembered and scattered, though this would require both physical capability and psychological hardness that seem unlikely in an elderly woman caring for her brother. Perhaps it was thrown into a river or, well, though local water sources were searched. Perhaps it was hidden in a location that subsequent development has covered over, buried in a field that is now beneath buildings, concealed in a structure that has since collapsed. These scenarios are possible but require either remarkable planning and capability or remarkable luck in never being discovered. Third, if Susanna murdered Owen, she would have been taking an enormous risk with very high stakes. Murder in Georgian England was a capital offence, punished by hanging and sometimes by the additional horror of being anatomized after death, having your body turned over to surgeons for dissection. Picture the public hangings that drew crowds, the bodies left dangling as warnings. This was the fate that awaited convicted murderers. If anyone suspected Susanna, if any evidence emerged linking her to Owen's death, she would face this terrible end. Would an elderly woman, exhausted and burdened but not described as cruel or unstable, really take such a risk? Moreover, the investigation after Owen's disappearance would have focused immediately on Susanna. Picture the local constable questioning her repeatedly, examining her cottage, talking to neighbours about her relationship with Owen, looking for any inconsistency in her story or any sign of guilt in her demeanour. She was the last person to see Owen alive, the person who stood to benefit most from his disappearance, the person with the means and opportunity. She would have been the obvious suspect. Yet apparently no evidence emerged to implicate her strongly enough to bring charges. Either she was completely innocent, or she was extraordinarily good at concealing guilt under intensive scrutiny. Some versions of this theory suggest that Susanna had help, perhaps from a male relative or neighbour who had grown close to her and wanted to free her from her burden. Picture a scenario where a man with strength and capability learned of Susanna's desperation, offered to solve her problem, and actually performed the killing and disposal while Susanna maintained plausible deniability. Perhaps she knew what would happen, but did not directly participate. Perhaps she returned to find Owen gone and realised what had occurred, then chose to keep silent rather than expose her accomplice. This variant addresses some problems with the theory it provides, the physical strength and capability that Susanna alone might have lacked. But it creates new problems. It requires a co-conspirator who kept silent for the rest of his life, who never confessed even on his deathbed, who never aroused suspicion. It requires Susanna to live with the knowledge of her brother's murder, to play-act confusion and grief, to maintain a lie for years or decades. Picture her in old age, knowing what happened to Owen, watching the mystery perplex others, never revealing the truth. This is possible, but it requires us to believe in extraordinary psychological resilience and commitment to deception. The murder theory also struggles with the question of what happened to Owen's possessions and clothing. If he was killed and buried, surely he was buried in the clothes he wore. But the blanket from his chair was still there when Susanna came outside. Picture the logistics. If someone killed Owen in his chair, they would need to remove his body but leave the blanket behind, or remove both and then return the blanket. Why bother with such staging? If they killed him earlier and brought him outside already dead, then moved him, again the blanket detail seems unnecessarily elaborate. The murder theory ultimately fails on several counts. It requires strong motive that is not documented, physical capability that seems beyond what was available, disposal effectiveness that is remarkable, psychological capacity for deception that is unusual, and accomplices who kept perfect silence. It cannot be ruled out entirely. Murders do sometimes succeed in hiding bodies permanently. Conspiracies do sometimes hold, but as an explanation for Owen's disappearance, it leaves much unexplained and requires many assumptions. A third theory, perhaps the most intriguing medically, is that Owen suddenly recovered from his paralysis. Imagine that his condition, which had persisted for years, suddenly and miraculously resolved. Sensation returned to limbs that had been unresponsive. Muscles that had atrophied over years of disuse somehow regained strength. The neural pathways that had been damaged or blocked were restored. Owen stood up from his chair, took his first steps in years, and walked away from his life as an invalid. This theory has some support from medical literature of the period. While medical understanding in 1763 was primitive, there were documented cases of people who appeared to recover from paralysis after extended periods. The term palsy covered various conditions, some of which may have been temporary or reversible. Picture a man diagnosed as permanently paralyzed due to stroke, but whose condition was actually a severe but temporary neurological disorder, or whose paralysis was psychological rather than purely physical. After years of immobility, some change occurs, perhaps another small stroke that paradoxically reverses damage from the first, perhaps a psychological breakthrough, perhaps simple medical misunderstanding resolving. In favor of this theory is the complete absence of Owen's body. If he was murdered or died naturally, his body should be somewhere. 1863 Somerset was not a large area, and searches were conducted thoroughly over a considerable period. Yet no grave was found, no remains discovered, no evidence of burial or concealment. If Owen simply walked away alive, there would be no body to find. The negative evidence, the absence of physical remains despite extensive searching, supports the possibility that Owen did not die in or near Shepton Mallet. Consider the moment of recovery from Owen's perspective. For years, his body had been a prison. He lay in bed or sat in his chair, unable to move himself, dependent for everything on his sister's care. His mind remained sharp, but trapped in an unresponsive body. Then, on that June afternoon, something changes. Perhaps it starts as a tingling sensation in his legs. Perhaps it's a sudden awareness that he can wiggle his toes, flex his ankles. The sensation spreads, strengthens. He realizes with growing amazement that he can move, that his body is responding again to his will. Imagine the emotions that would accompany such a moment. Joy, surely, incredible, overwhelming joy. Disbelief, testing and retesting his newfound mobility to ensure it's real. wonder at what would seem like a miracle, but perhaps also confusion or disorientation. After years of immobility, suddenly being able to move might be overwhelming, might produce a kind of sensory overload or psychological shock. Owen standing on legs that had not borne his weight in years, taking tentative steps, finding his balance, moving with increasing confidence. But then this theory encounters serious problems. Why would Owen not call out to Susanna immediately? Why would he not shout in amazement and joy to tell her of his recovery? Even if confusion or disorientation affected him, surely his first instinct would be to share this miraculous news with the sister who had cared for him so devotedly for so long. Picture Susanna inside the cottage, just a few yards away. One shout from Owen would bring her running, yet she heard nothing until she came outside to find him gone. Some versions of this theory suggest that Owen's recovery was accompanied by profound confusion or altered mental state. Perhaps the same neurological event that restored his mobility also affected his cognition, his memory, his sense of identity. Picture Owen standing up, his mind clouded and uncertain, not fully understanding where he is or who he is, driven by instinct or impulse to move, to walk, to escape. He leaves the chair and simply walks away, not with a plan but with a compulsion. In this confused state, he might have left Shepton Mallet, wandered into unfamiliar territory, become lost, and died of exposure or accident somewhere. His body would not be connected to the missing, paralyzed man from Somerset. This variant addresses the question of why Owen would not have called to Susanna, but it creates new problems. If Owen walked away in a confused state and died shortly after, his body should have been found eventually. Picture searchers combing the countryside around Shepton Mallet in the days and weeks after the disappearance. They would have been looking in fields, woods, along roads and paths. A body, even in a confused state, cannot walk that far before someone sees it or it collapses. The ring of search would have expanded outward from the village. Unless Owen walked much farther than seems possible for someone who had not walked in years, his body should have been within the search area. Another variant suggests that Owen recovered and deliberately chose to disappear to start a new life. After years as a burden to his sister, years of helplessness and dependence, perhaps he saw his miraculous recovery as a chance to begin again. Picture Owen standing for the first time in years, making a split-second decision not to return to his old life, but to walk away from it entirely. Perhaps he felt shame at having been a burden. Perhaps he wanted his sister to be free of caring for him. Perhaps he simply wanted the adventure and freedom that had been denied him during his years of paralysis. He walks away from Shepton Mallet, perhaps travelling to a city like Bristol or Bath or even London, where he could be anonymous and start fresh. But this variant requires us to believe several improbable things. First, that Owen could walk any significant distance after years of paralysis. Even if sensation and basic motor function returned, his muscles would have been severely atrophied. Picture trying to walk after years in bed. Even a few steps would be exhausting and painful. Walking miles to reach another town seems nearly impossible. Second, that Owen would choose to vanish without a word to his devoted sister. Yes, he might want to free her from the burden of his care, but complete disappearance seems cruelly unnecessary. A note, a message, some way of letting her know he was alive and well, surely he would have managed that eventually. Third, that he would successfully establish a new identity and never be recognized or reported. In Georgian England, strangers were noticed and discussed. Someone matching Owen's description and age, newly arrived in a town, would draw attention. Someone might recognize him, or word might filter back to Somerset. The medical plausibility of sudden complete recovery from years of true physical paralysis is the gravest problem with this theory. Modern medical understanding makes clear that certain types of paralysis can resolve, but these are typically temporary conditions or psychological in origin. True physical paralysis from significant stroke damage or spinal cord injury does not spontaneously reverse after years. The medical reality: if Owen's paralysis was caused by a stroke that damaged brain tissue controlling movement, that tissue would not regenerate years later. If it was caused by spinal injury, that damage would not suddenly heal. The cases in historical literature that describe recovery from long-term paralysis are likely cases of misdiagnosis, psychological paralysis, or exaggeration. Moreover, even in the rare cases where some recovery occurs from paralysis, it is typically gradual, not sudden. A recovery process that takes weeks or months, with slow improvement and rehabilitation. The idea that Owen would go from completely unable to move himself to able to stand and walk away in the span of 15 minutes strains medical credibility beyond breaking. If his recovery were gradual, Susanna would have noticed signs of it in the days or weeks before his disappearance. The sudden, complete recovery required by this theory is simply not how paralysis typically resolves. If we accept the possibility of recovery despite medical implausibility, we still face the overwhelming problem of Owen's subsequent absence. Even if he walked away, where did he go? For 260 years, no trace of Owen Parfitt has ever surfaced. No deathbed confession identified him. No records from another town matched his description. No family member later discovered he had been living elsewhere. The silence is complete. A man living under a different name in some other part of England, perhaps working, perhaps remarrying, living out his remaining years and dying without anyone ever connecting him to the missing man from Shepton Mallet. Is this possible? Barely. Is it probable? No. The recovery theory is appealing because it explains the absence of a body and provides a non-criminal explanation for the disappearance. But it requires us to accept medical impossibility, to imagine Owen walking away without alerting his sister, and to explain why no trace of him ever emerged, despite 2.5 centuries of curiosity and investigation. Like the other theories, it has fatal flaws that prevent it from being a satisfying explanation. A fourth theory ventures into the supernatural, acknowledging that rational explanations seem to fail and suggesting that forces beyond human understanding were responsible for Owen's disappearance. In the Georgian era, the boundary between natural and supernatural was less clearly defined than it is today. Common people and even educated ones believed in divine intervention, demonic possession, fairies, ghosts, and other entities outside the natural order. When something inexplicable occurred, supernatural explanation was not merely accepted but expected by many. The villagers of Shepton Mallet discussing Owen's disappearance in 1763. Some would propose that God had taken Owen, assumed him bodily into heaven, as he had done with Enoch and Elijah according to biblical accounts. Perhaps Owen, despite his suffering, or because of it, had found special grace. Perhaps his paralysis was a trial that he had passed, and God rewarded him by removing him from earthly suffering directly into paradise. This explanation would provide comfort by removing human agency, making Owen's fate a blessed one rather than a tragic one, and placing the event within a religious framework that made sense to believers. Others might suggest darker supernatural forces. Perhaps the devil had claimed Owen for some unknown sin, seizing him bodily and dragging him to hell. Such an explanation would generate fear. If the devil could take a man in broad daylight from a populated village, no one was safe. Or perhaps it was not the devil himself, but some demonic entity, some evil spirit that had taken interest in Owen for incomprehensible reasons. The paralysis itself might be seen as evidence of demonic affliction, and the disappearance as the culmination of that dark attention. Folklore provided other possible explanations. Fairies, or the fair folk, according to Celtic and English tradition, were known to abduct humans, particularly those who were vulnerable or different in some way. Owen's paralysis making him liminal, not quite belonging to the normal world of activity and capability, and thus attractive to fairy interest. The Fae might have taken him to their realm, a place outside normal time and space, where he might live in a kind of eternal present or serve some incomprehensible purpose. Such stories were part of rural belief systems, passed down through generations, still credited by many in 1763, even as educated society was beginning to dismiss them as superstition. Some might have suggested witchcraft. Perhaps a witch in the village or nearby had some grievance against Owen or Susanna, had cast a spell or curse that caused Owen to vanish. Neighbours casting suspicious glances at any woman who lived alone, who had a reputation for being odd, who might have been seen near the cottage. Witch accusations were less common in 1763 than they had been a century earlier, but belief in witchcraft had not entirely disappeared, particularly in rural areas. The complete inexplicability of Owen's disappearance might make supernatural malevolence seem like a reasonable explanation. Modern paranormal enthusiasts have added their own supernatural theories. Some suggest alien abduction, with Owen being taken aboard an extraterrestrial spacecraft for purposes unknown, a flying saucer hovering above Shepton Mallet, beaming Owen up from his chair while his sister is inside. This theory requires us to believe that technologically advanced aliens would have interest in a paralyzed elderly human, that they could remove him without disturbing the chair or blanket or being seen by anyone else in the village, and that no other evidence of their presence was left behind. Other modern supernatural theories involve time slips or dimensional portals. Perhaps Owen accidentally passed through a tear in space-time, finding himself transported to another era or another reality entirely. A doorway opening in the air before Owen's chair, invisible to others but somehow drawing him through, depositing him in a different when or where from which he could never return. This theory draws more from science fiction than from any established physics, but it has the appeal of explaining the complete disappearance without requiring a body to be hidden. Some have suggested spontaneous human combustion, a controversial phenomenon where a person allegedly bursts into flames without external ignition source. But this theory fails immediately in Owen's case because no ash, no scorch marks, no evidence of fire was found on or around the chair. If Owen had burned, there would be remains. The complete absence of physical evidence contradicts any combustion theory. The problem with all supernatural theories is that they are not really explanations at all. To say that God took Owen, or aliens abducted him, or he slipped through a dimensional portal, is simply to say that we do not know what happened and attribute it to forces beyond investigation or understanding. Supernatural explanations are unfalsifiable. They cannot be proven false because they appeal to powers that operate outside natural law. A supernatural theory is a way of saying, this is unknowable, while using mystical language to make that unknowability feel more satisfying. Moreover, supernatural theories do not explain why Owen specifically was targeted. If God was taking people bodily to heaven, why Owen among all the paralyzed, suffering people in the world? If aliens were abducting humans, why a paralyzed elderly man in rural England? If fairies were stealing people, why him and not others? The specificity of the event, this particular man, this particular time and place, seems to require some explanation even in supernatural terms, yet none is provided. From a rational, naturalistic perspective, supernatural theories can be dismissed as products of limited understanding and cultural belief systems that are no longer credible. We know now that paralyzed people are not carried to heaven bodily, that demons do not literally drag sinners to hell, that fairies do not steal humans to their realm. These were ways of making sense of the inexplicable in an era before modern science provided better frameworks for understanding. That some people in 1763 believed supernatural forces took, Owen tells us about their worldview, but it does not tell us what actually happened to him. Yet we should not be too quick to feel superior to those who proposed supernatural explanations. When confronted with an event that violates everything we understand about how the world works, we too reach for explanations that, while framed in modern language, are essentially appeals to the unknowable. When we say Owen must have been abducted by a perfectly executed criminal conspiracy that left no evidence, or that he recovered through a medical miracle and walked away unseen, are we really doing anything different than those who said fairies took him? We are using different vocabulary, but we are performing the same function, trying to explain the apparently inexplicable by appealing to something barely within the realm of possibility. The question of what evidence might still exist, somewhere, that could shed light on Owen's disappearance is worth extended consideration. In 1763, the tools available for investigating a disappearance were limited to direct observation, questioning of witnesses, and physical searches. There were no photographs to document the scene, no fingerprinting technology, no forensic analysis of trace evidence. The constable would have relied entirely on what he could see with his eyes, what people told him, and what conclusions he could draw from those limited inputs. Consider what we would do differently if Owen disappeared today. The scene would be photographed extensively from multiple angles. The chair would be examined for fingerprints, for trace DNA, for any microscopic evidence of who might have touched it or moved it. Security cameras might have captured something, though in a small village like Shepton Mallet, even today such cameras might not be present. Cell phone records could track who was in the area. Social media might reveal communications or plans. Digital forensics could recover deleted messages or search histories that might point toward conspiracy or planning. But in 1763, none of this existed. The constable had only eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen nothing, a chair that yielded no secrets, and a paralyzed man who had vanished without trace. The investigation was limited by the technology and methods of the era. This does not mean it was incompetent. The constable likely did everything that could be done with the tools available. It simply means that, if evidence existed that could have solved the case, much of it was invisible to 18th-century investigation methods. This raises an interesting philosophical question about evidence and truth. Did evidence of what happened to Owen exist at the time? Almost certainly yes. If someone carried him away, that person left footprints, perhaps dropped a fibre from their clothing, certainly created a scene that contained clues. If Owen's body was buried, the burial site existed as physical fact, even if searchers did not find it. The truth was there, encoded in physical reality, but truth and accessibility are not the same thing. Truth that cannot be accessed might as well not exist from an investigative standpoint. In modern forensic investigations, we talk about Locard's exchange principle. Every contact leaves a trace. When two objects touch, they exchange material at the microscopic level. A person walking through a room leaves fibers from their clothing, picks up dust on their shoes, deposits skin cells and hair. These traces can be recovered and analyzed to reconstruct what happened. But this principle, while physically true in any era, was invisible and inaccessible to investigators in 1763. The traces existed. Owen's abductor or killer left traces if such a person existed, but they could not be detected or analyzed with available technology. This is one reason why cold cases sometimes get solved decades after the original crime. New technology makes previously invisible evidence visible. DNA analysis can identify a suspect from trace evidence that was collected but could not be analyzed when it was collected. Digital records can reveal connections between people that were not apparent before. But Owen Parfitt's case predates not just DNA analysis, but essentially all modern forensic techniques. Whatever physical evidence existed in 1763 has long since been destroyed by time, weather, and the normal processes of change and decay. There is also the question of what was not investigated, because it did not occur to anyone to investigate it. Modern detectives look for things that 18th-century constables would not have thought to look for because the conceptual framework for such evidence did not exist. Financial records, for instance, today we would examine bank accounts and transactions looking for suspicious payments or unusual activity. But in rural England in 1763, many transactions were in cash or barter. Few ordinary people had significant banking relationships, and the paper trail we take for granted today largely did not exist. Or consider victimology, the modern practice of studying the victim's life in detail to understand who might have wanted to harm them. Today, we would interview everyone who knew Owen, map his social network, look for conflicts or grudges or unusual relationships. Some of this was surely done in 1763, but probably not systematically or comprehensively. The concept of thoroughly investigating the victim's background as a routine part of solving a crime was not yet standard practice. Perhaps there was something in Owen's past, some connection or conflict that would have pointed toward an explanation, but if no one thought to look for it, it would have remained hidden. The constable in 1763 would have been working from common-sense assumptions about how disappearances happen. Someone who vanishes has either walked away, been taken away, or died and been concealed. Since Owen could not walk, he must have been taken or died and been concealed. Look for witnesses to the taking, or evidence of concealment. When no such witnesses or evidence materialized, the investigation reached a dead end. A modern investigator might think more broadly about unlikely scenarios, might use statistical analysis of similar cases to guide the investigation, might employ psychological profiling, but these tools were not available then. We should also consider what evidence might have existed but was not recognized as such. Someone in the village probably saw something relevant but did not realize it was relevant. Perhaps someone noticed a cart that they later forgot about because it seemed perfectly normal at the time. Perhaps someone saw two men carrying something, but assumed it was ordinary cargo and thought nothing of it. Perhaps there were small details that, assembled together, would have pointed toward an explanation, but which remained scattered and disconnected because no one saw how to connect them. This is a common problem in investigations even today. Witnesses have relevant information but do not come forward because they do not realize what they saw matters. Or they come forward but provide information in a way that obscures its importance. Or they do not remember details that might be crucial because those details seemed insignificant at the time. In 1763, with a less sophisticated understanding of how to conduct investigations and what information might be important, this problem would have been even more acute. There is also the possibility that someone had direct knowledge of what happened but chose to remain silent. Perhaps the person who took Owen, if someone did, was known to others in the village, but those others chose not to inform on them. Perhaps Susanna knew more than she said. Perhaps a witness saw something but feared repercussions of speaking up. Silence, whether from fear or loyalty or self-interest, can hide truth as effectively as the absence of evidence. In close-knit communities like Shepton Mallet, social dynamics could powerfully influence what information emerged and what remained hidden. If someone prominent or well-liked was suspected, others might close ranks to protect them. If revealing information would expose one's own wrongdoing or shameful associations, one might choose silence. If the person with knowledge was vulnerable, a servant, a child, someone dependent on others' goodwill, they might not dare speak. The truth might have been known to multiple people but never officially revealed because social pressure or fear prevented it. Consider also the possibility of gradual corruption of truth over time. The initial facts, as reported to the constable, may have been accurate, but as the story was retold, as it passed through multiple retellings over years, and then decades and then centuries, details may have changed. Perhaps the 15 minutes was actually 30, or perhaps it was 5. Perhaps Owen's paralysis was not quite as complete as later accounts suggest. Perhaps there were witnesses who saw something ambiguous, but their testimony was simplified or exaggerated in later retellings. The story we know today may not perfectly match what actually happened, because it has been filtered through centuries of retelling and reinterpretation. This is not to suggest the case is fictional or that major facts are wrong, but any historical event, when examined at a distance of centuries, must be understood as reconstructed from sources that may be incomplete, biased, or somewhat inaccurate. We do the best we can with what we have, but we should maintain appropriate humility about the certainty of our knowledge. Some details we think we know about Owen Parfitt may be wrong. Some aspects of his case may have been misunderstood from the beginning. The impossibility that seems so stark to us might be slightly less impossible if we had access to the full, unfiltered truth as it was experienced by those who lived it. Yet even with all these caveats and acknowledgements of limitation, the core mystery remains. Whatever the exact details, whatever small facts may have been lost or distorted, the fundamental situation is clear. Owen Parfitt, a paralyzed man unable to move himself, was in a chair one moment and gone the next, and despite all efforts then and since, no satisfactory explanation has emerged. That core impossibility persists regardless of questions about evidence and investigation methods. Even if we had better information, even if every detail was certain, we might still face the same baffling absence of explanation. Modern researchers who examine the case have both advantages and disadvantages compared to the original investigators. They have historical perspective, can compare Owen's disappearance to other cases across time and geography, can apply analytical methods that did not exist in 1763. They can think about the case in ways that may not have occurred to the constable, but they cannot interview witnesses, cannot examine the actual scene, cannot follow leads as they emerge hot and fresh. They are working entirely from historical documents, and those documents are sparse, a few paragraphs in local histories, mentions in parish records, the accumulated speculation of 2.5 centuries. Some modern researchers have attempted physical investigation, using technology to search for Owen's remains. Ground-penetrating radar can detect disturbances in soil that might indicate burial sites. Metal detectors can find objects associated with burials. Systematic excavation of promising sites might uncover remains that earlier searches missed. But Somerset has changed enormously in 260 years. Building, farming, flooding, erosion, landscaping all have altered the ground. Even if Owen's body was buried somewhere in or near Shepton Mallet, finding it now would require remarkable luck unless we could narrow down the location significantly. And if his body was disposed of in a way that left no permanent trace, thoroughly burned, thrown into deep water, concealed in a structure that has since collapsed or been demolished, then no modern technology will find it. The statistical reality of old unsolved disappearances is that most bodies which were not found within weeks or months of the event will never be found. Time and natural processes erase physical evidence. Buildings are demolished. Landscapes change. Memories fade and die with those who held them. After 2.5 centuries, the probability of finding Owen Parfitt's remains approaches zero, regardless of technology or determination. This is frustrating but also humbling. We live in an age that trusts technology to solve problems that previous generations could not solve. We have come to expect that if we simply apply enough computing power, enough analytical capability, enough clever thinking, we can answer any question. Owen Parfitt's case reminds us that some questions may be genuinely unanswerable, not because we are not smart enough or lack adequate technology, but because the information needed to answer them does not exist in recoverable form. This is a difficult truth to accept, but it may be the truth nonetheless. The supernatural theory, in its various forms, represents the human need to make sense of events. The supernatural theory, in its various forms, represents the human need to make sense of events even when no sensible explanation is available. It acknowledges that Owen's disappearance defies natural explanation, but rather than accepting that we simply do not know what happened, It provides narrative closure through appeal to mystical forces. This may be psychologically comforting, but it does not advance our actual understanding of the case. A fifth theory, more mundane than supernatural but perhaps more plausible than some others, suggests that Owen died naturally while sitting in his chair, and that Susanna disposed of his body not out of murderous intent, but out of panic, confusion, or fear. This theory occupies a middle ground between innocent and guilty, suggesting that Susanna may have committed a crime, concealing a death, improper burial, but not the crime of murder. The scenario: Susanna goes inside the cottage, leaving Owen sitting in his chair outside. The minutes pass. Owen is alone, elderly, in poor health from years of paralysis. His heart, weakened by age and inactivity, simply stops beating, or his breathing ceases. Or a stroke, another one, kills him quickly and quietly. When Susanna emerges from the cottage 15 minutes later, she finds Owen sitting in his chair, still upright, but dead. No violent death, no struggle, just the quiet passing that might come to any elderly person with serious health problems. Now imagine Susanna's state of mind in that moment. She has been caring for Owen for years, has shaped her entire life around his needs. Suddenly, he is gone. The shock, the grief, the sudden disorienting absence of the burden that has defined her days, all of this would be overwhelming. But beyond emotion, there might be fear. A death without witnesses, particularly of someone in Susanna's care, might raise suspicions. Picture her thinking, will the constable believe Owen died naturally? Will I be accused of killing him, of finally tiring of his care and ending his life? Will I hang for a death I did not cause? Or perhaps her reaction is not rational calculation but simple panic. An elderly woman, already exhausted from years of caregiving, confronted with her brother's corpse, unable to process what has happened or think clearly about what to do next. In shock and confusion, she makes a terrible decision. She will hide his death. Perhaps she summons a neighbor she trusts, or perhaps she acts alone. She removes Owen's body from the chair, difficult but not impossible, with adrenaline and determination, and hides it somewhere she knows it will not be easily found. Where might she have hidden it? The cottage itself is a possibility. In a small rural dwelling with an earthen floor, Susanna could have dragged Owen inside, dug a grave beneath the floor, buried him there, then smoothed the earth over. This would be enormously difficult physical labor, but fear and desperation can produce remarkable strength. The cottage was her home. She knew every inch of it. She would know where to dig, how to conceal fresh earth, how to arrange furniture or possessions to hide signs of disturbance. When searches came later, looking for evidence of Owen being taken away, they would find nothing because Owen had never left. Another possibility is burial in a garden or yard. A patch of vegetables or herbs behind the cottage, soil that would not seem unusual if disturbed. Susanna could claim to have been gardening if anyone noticed fresh-turned earth. Or perhaps a midden heap, where refuse was disposed of, who would think to search thoroughly in household waste. Or some location she knew of nearby, a place she could access without being seen, where the ground was soft enough to dig and concealed enough that casual searches would not examine it. Once Owen's body was hidden, Susanna could have cleaned herself, composed herself, and then raised the alarm that Owen had vanished. She would not be lying exactly. He was indeed gone from his chair. She could express genuine confusion and grief because she would feel those emotions even if she knew where Owen actually was. The constable questioning her, looking for signs of deception, while she answers truthfully about what she found when she came outside. The chair empty, Owen gone. Her story would hold because it was essentially true, just incomplete. This theory has several advantages. It explains why there were no witnesses to Owen's removal, because the removal happened with Susanna's knowledge and possibly assistance, at a time when she could control who saw what. It explains why no body was found despite extensive searches, because Susanna knew where it was and had hidden it somewhere that would not be obvious. It explains why Susanna could seem credible when questioned, because she was not lying about the important facts, just omitting what happened after she found Owen dead. It also provides a more sympathetic view of Susanna than the murder theory does. She is not a killer in this scenario, just a frightened, confused woman who panicked and made a terrible decision. She would live with this secret for the rest of her life. Every time someone mentioned Owen's disappearance, every time the mystery was discussed, she would know the truth but could never speak it. She would have denied Owen a proper burial, a Christian funeral, the respect due to the dead. This would weigh on her conscience but perhaps seem preferable to the alternative of being suspected of murder. But this theory also has problems. First, the physical difficulty of moving and burying a body, even for someone motivated by panic. Owen was dead weight, probably at least 100 pounds. Susanna was elderly. Even if grief or fear gave her temporary strength, physically managing a corpse is extraordinarily difficult. Picture trying to drag an adult body across a floor, to lift it into a grave, to move it at all without making noise or attracting attention. This is not impossible, but it is not easy either. Second, the psychological difficulty of living with such a secret. Imagine keeping silent for years, perhaps decades, knowing where Owen's body was while everyone else wondered and searched and theorized. Attending church, speaking with neighbors, going about daily life while holding this knowledge. Some people could do it, certainly, but it would require remarkable psychological fortitude and capacity for sustained deception. Would Susanna, who by all accounts had been a devoted and caring sister, be capable of this? Third, this theory still requires the body to be hidden so effectively that searches never found it. While hiding a body in a cottage floor or garden is more plausible than some other scenarios, it still needs to account for the fact that no remains have surfaced in 2.5 centuries. Buildings are renovated, floors are dug up, gardens are turned over. If Owen was buried in or near the cottage, chances are good that his remains would have been discovered at some point. The fact that they have not been suggests either remarkable luck in concealment or that this theory is incorrect. Fourth, there is the question of why Susanna would choose concealment over honestly reporting Owen's death. Yes, she might fear suspicion, but was that fear well-founded? Natural death among elderly paralyzed people was hardly unusual. If Owen simply died in his chair and Susanna reported it immediately, would there really have been serious suspicion of murder? Picture a different scenario. Susanna comes outside, finds Owen dead, immediately calls for help. The constable examines the body, finds no signs of violence, concludes that Owen died of natural causes. A brief investigation, a burial, grief and adjustment for Susanna, but no criminal suspicion. This seems like the more likely outcome if Owen had actually died naturally. The natural death and concealment theory is perhaps the most plausible of all the theories we have examined, but it still requires assumptions about Susanna's capability, psychology, and decision-making that we have no strong evidence for. It is possible, but possibility is not the same as probability. We are still left without a theory that fully satisfies, that explains all the facts without requiring us to believe things that strain credibility. Beyond the specific theories about what happened to Owen Parfitt, his disappearance raises broader questions about the nature of mystery itself and why certain cases capture and hold public attention across centuries. What is it about this particular disappearance, among all the tragic or inexplicable events in history, that makes it memorable and compelling more than 260 years later? Part of the answer lies in the fundamental impossibility at the heart of the case. Consider a spectrum of mysteries, ranging from those that are merely difficult to solve to those that seem to violate the laws of nature. Owen Parfitt's disappearance sits toward the impossible end of that spectrum. A person who cannot move himself cannot leave his chair and walk away. Therefore, someone else must have moved him. But no one saw anyone move him, and no evidence of such removal exists. Therefore, either our understanding of physical law is incomplete, or something happened that we simply cannot explain with the information available to us. This impossibility is intellectually fascinating. It presents a puzzle that our rational minds want to solve but cannot. Imagine the psychological appeal of such a challenge. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, driven to make sense of the world around us. We want cause to lead to effect, action to leave evidence, mysteries to have solutions. When we encounter a case like Owen Parfitt's, which seems to resist all attempts at explanation despite being apparently simple, it challenges our fundamental assumptions about how reality works. This is uncomfortable but also compelling. The mind returns to the puzzle again and again, trying different angles, hoping that this time the pieces will finally fit together. The impossibility also makes the case memorable because it is easy to communicate. You can explain the essential mystery of Owen Parfitt in a single sentence. A paralyzed man vanished from his chair in 15 minutes and was never found. That sentence contains everything necessary to convey why the case is interesting. Contrast this with mysteries that require extensive background information to understand why they are mysterious at all. Owen's case has the virtue of elegant simplicity. The facts are straightforward, the impossibility is obvious, and the absence of solution is clear. This makes it an ideal story to share, to discuss, to pass down through generations. Another factor in the case's endurance is its human scale. This is not a mystery involving world leaders, international conspiracies, or earth-shaking events. It is profoundly local and intimate. One man, one cottage, one village, one afternoon. The smallness of the scene, Owen in his chair, Susanna in the cottage, neighbours passing in the lane. This could be anyone's village, anyone's family, anyone's tragedy. The human dimensions make it relatable. We can imagine ourselves in Susanna's position, caring for a disabled relative, stepping away for a few minutes, returning to find them inexplicably gone. We can imagine the confusion, the rising panic, the desperate hope that some reasonable explanation would emerge. The mystery also endures because it represents something fundamental about the human condition, the experience of loss without closure. Susanna, in the months and years after Owen's disappearance, every day she must have wondered what happened to him. Did he suffer? Was he killed quickly? Or did death come slowly? Where is his body? Will it ever be found? Will she ever know the truth? These questions, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, would have haunted her for the rest of her life. And this experience of permanent uncertainty is something most people can understand, even if they have never experienced an actual disappearance. Most of us have known loss with unanswered questions. Why did this happen? Could I have prevented it? Was there something I should have seen, should have done? What were their last moments like? Did they think of me? These questions may not be answerable even in situations where we know what physically happened. Owen Parfitt's case is an extreme version of this universal human experience. Susanna lost her brother and never knew why or how. She had questions that would remain forever open. In this sense, his disappearance is not just a historical puzzle, but a metaphor for the permanent uncertainties that accompany human existence. The case also speaks to our awareness of vulnerability and the fragility of ordinary life. Picture yourself going about your daily routine, confident in your understanding of how the world works, secure in the belief that reality follows certain rules. Then something happens that should not be possible, and suddenly the world feels less certain, less comprehensible, less safe. Owen's disappearance would have had this effect on the people of Shepton Mallet. If a helpless man could vanish in broad daylight with no one seeing anything, What else might happen that seems impossible? What other certainties might prove illusory? This unsettling of fundamental assumptions creates lasting unease, but it also makes the case memorable. It serves as a reminder that the world is stranger and more unpredictable than we usually acknowledge. In the modern era, Owen Parfitt's case has found new life through internet communities devoted to unsolved mysteries. Online forums, discussion boards, YouTube videos, and podcasts have introduced the case to audiences who might never have heard of it otherwise. People around the world, separated by vast distances and different cultures, coming together to discuss what might have happened to an elderly paralyzed man in 18th-century England. Some approach it as a historical puzzle to be solved through careful research and logical analysis. Others see it as potential evidence for paranormal phenomena. Still others engage with it as a philosophical meditation on the limits of human knowledge. This modern interest generates new theories and interpretations constantly. Someone proposes that Owen was taken for medical experimentation, his paralyzed body valuable to physicians studying anatomy. Someone else suggests a conspiracy involving the church or local gentry. Someone else revives old supernatural theories with modern paranormal language. These new theories rarely have more evidence than the old ones, but they demonstrate the case's continuing ability to engage imagination and provoke speculation. The case functions as a kind of historical Rorschach test, onto which each era projects its own fears, beliefs, and frameworks for understanding mystery. The fact that Owen's disappearance occurred so long ago actually enhances rather than diminishes its appeal in some ways. Picture the layers of time separating us from the event. 260 years, multiple generations, vast changes in technology and society. The world Owen lived in is almost incomprehensibly different from ours. People travelled by foot and horse, communicated face to face, lived and died within small geographical areas. Yet the core mystery remains perfectly accessible to modern understanding. We may not know what it felt like to live in Georgian England, but we understand exactly what it means for someone to vanish without explanation and never be found. The historical distance also adds an element of romance and mystery that contemporary cases may lack. There is something almost gothic about the case: the paralyzed man, the devoted sister, the empty chair, the complete disappearance. It has the structure of a folk tale or legend. Indeed, Owen's disappearance has become part of Somerset folklore, told alongside ghost stories and local legends woven into the cultural heritage of the region. Picture tourists visiting Shepton Mallet today, asking about the mystery, walking streets that have changed beyond recognition, trying to imagine where Owen's cottage might have stood. The line between history and legend blurs, and the case exists in both realms simultaneously. The absence of resolution plays a crucial role in the case's endurance. If Owen's body had been found a week or month or year after his disappearance, the mystery would be largely resolved or at least significantly diminished. We would know where he ended up, possibly how he died, perhaps even who was responsible. The case might still be remembered as a historical curiosity, but it would not have the same lasting power. It is precisely because Owen was never found, because no trace of him ever surfaced, because the mystery remains as pure and unsolved today as it was in 1763, that the case continues to fascinate. Picture an open file that has never been closed, a question that has never been answered, a puzzle with missing pieces that can never be found. This permanent openness is both frustrating and compelling. Psychologically, humans have complex relationships with uncertainty. We generally prefer certainty and closure. We want to know what happened, understand why it happened, identify who was responsible. Unsolved mysteries create cognitive dissonance, a gap between our desire for answers and the reality that answers are not available. This discomfort normally motivates us to search for resolution. But paradoxically, The very absence of resolution can make mysteries more rather than less engaging. The lack of closure keeps us thinking, keeps us returning to the case, keeps us hoping that maybe this time we will see something previous investigators missed, make a connection no one else has made. Owen Parfitt's disappearance also serves as a kind of test case for our beliefs about reality. How you interpret this case reveals something about how you understand the world. If you believe reality is fundamentally explicable through natural law, then Owen's case is simply an unsolved mystery that would be solved if we had more information. The answer exists. We just do not have access to it. If you believe in possibilities beyond natural law, then Owen's case might be evidence for supernatural or paranormal phenomena. If you believe in human ingenuity and deception, then Owen's case might be a reminder that sometimes people successfully conceal truth permanently. The case becomes a mirror reflecting our own assumptions and worldviews. There is also a narrative satisfaction to mysteries like Owen's, even without resolution. Picture the story structure: establishment of character and setting, inciting incident, investigation and rising action, multiple possible resolutions presented and examined, ultimate lack of definitive conclusion. This is a complete narrative in its own way, just not one that ends with the revelation we typically expect from mystery stories. The absence of resolution becomes part of the story itself, part of what makes it meaningful and memorable. We are storytelling creatures, and even stories without conventional endings can be deeply satisfying if they are well told and contain genuine substance. The case also holds a particular place in the history of missing persons investigations and the evolution of how societies respond to unexplained disappearances. In 1763, when someone vanished, the response was largely local and informal. The family raised alarm, neighbours helped search, the local constable made inquiries. But there was no systematic approach, no coordinated effort beyond the immediate community, no way to spread information widely about a missing person. If Owen had somehow travelled beyond the immediate area, no one in the next town would have known to look for him or recognise him. Contrast this with modern missing persons cases, where information can be disseminated globally within hours. Photographs shared on social media, alerts sent to millions of devices, databases that can be searched by investigators anywhere. The infrastructure for responding to disappearances has evolved enormously. Yet for all this infrastructure, people still vanish without explanation. The basic human mystery of disappearance, here one moment, gone the next. No satisfactory explanation persists, despite technology. Owen Parfitt's case reminds us that technology changes our capabilities, but does not eliminate mystery. The case also raises questions about how communities process collective trauma and uncertainty. Shepton Mallet experienced something deeply unsettling. The impossible had occurred in their midst. How did this affect the community in the long term? Did it change how people viewed their village, their neighbours, their safety? Did it make them more suspicious, more cautious? Or did it eventually become just another story, absorbed into local law, no longer actively disturbing but simply part of the town's history? We know that unexplained events can have lasting psychological effects on communities. The certainty that most people rely on the belief that the world follows predictable patterns, that causes have effects, that things happen for reasons we can in principle understand is challenged when something truly inexplicable occurs. This challenge can produce lasting unease, a sense that the world is less orderly and more dangerous than previously believed. Or it can produce a kind of defensive skepticism, where people convince themselves that there must be a rational explanation even if they cannot identify it, because accepting genuine inexplicability is too disturbing. For Shepton Mallet, Owen's disappearance would have been a defining event for that generation. People would have divided their lives into before and after. Before Owen vanished, the world made sense. After Owen vanished, uncertainty crept into their understanding of reality. Children born after the event would grow up hearing the story, would absorb it as part of their sense of place, would come to see their village as the place where the impossible thing happened. This would shape community identity in subtle but real ways. The case also tells us something about how societies remember and commemorate mysteries. There is no memorial to Owen Parfitt in Shepton Mallet, no plaque marking where his cottage stood, no annual remembrance of his disappearance. He exists primarily in historical records and in the retelling of his story by those interested in mysteries. This is perhaps as it should be. Owen was not a person of historical importance. His disappearance did not affect broader events. Yet there is something poignant about this absence of physical commemoration. A man lived, suffered, vanished, and the physical world shows no trace that any of it happened. This raises philosophical questions about what kinds of events and people deserve commemoration. We build monuments to the famous, the powerful, those who shaped history in obvious ways. We remember wars and revolutions and great achievements. But ordinary lives, ordinary suffering, ordinary mysteries, these largely go uncommemorated, except in personal memory and family stories. When the last person who remembers dies, much of ordinary human experience vanishes as thoroughly as Owen Parfitt did from his chair. Perhaps this is inevitable given the vast number of human lives and the limited capacity for collective memory. But it is worth noting that most of human experience, including most human suffering and mystery, goes unrecorded and uncommemorated. Owen's case does get retold, does persist in collective memory, but in a particular way as a mystery, not as a human story. We remember the impossibility of his vanishing more than we remember Owen himself. When people discuss the case, they focus on theories and possibilities and the puzzle of it all. The actual man, his experiences, his suffering, his humanity, these recede behind the mystery. This is probably unavoidable given how little we know about Owen as a person. But it is worth acknowledging that in remembering the mystery, we risk forgetting the human being at its center. There is also something to be said about how Owen's case reflects broader patterns in how mysteries accumulate and persist. Certain types of events, impossible disappearances, unexplained deaths, sightings of things that should not exist, capture human imagination in ways that other events do not. We are drawn to the inexplicable, the uncanny, the edges of our understanding. Owen's case has persisted not because it is historically important, but because it is mysterious. And in persisting, it joins a collection of similar cases that together form a kind of canon of the inexplicable. This canon serves various functions. For some people, it is evidence that the world contains more than naturalistic explanations can account for. For others, it is a reminder of the limits of human knowledge. For still others, it is simply entertainment, a collection of fascinating puzzles to ponder. Whatever function it serves, the existence of this canon of persistent mysteries tells us something about human psychology and the kinds of stories that engage us across generations and cultures. Owen Parfitt's disappearance, viewed in this broader context, is one example among many of events that resist explanation and thereby capture attention. But it is perhaps a particularly pure example because of its simplicity and the stark impossibility at its core. There are no complicating factors, no ambiguous evidence, no elaborate conspiracy theories needed. A paralyzed man vanished in 15 minutes from a populated place. That is the whole mystery in its essential form. Everything else is elaboration and speculation built on that simple, impossible foundation. In the end, Owen Parfitt endures as a mystery, not despite its lack of solution, but in large part because of it. In the end, Owen Parfitt endures as a mystery, not despite its lack of solution, but in large part because of it. If the case were solved, it would become a footnote in the annals of Georgian crime or medical oddity. Unsolved, it becomes something larger, a reminder of human limitation, a testament to the persistence of the unknowable. an invitation to confront the limits of our understanding. Every generation approaches it fresh, proposes theories, comes up short. The mystery persists, and in persisting, serves purposes beyond the specific question of what happened to one man on one afternoon in 1763. As we reach the end of our exploration of Owen Parfitt's disappearance, we must reflect honestly on what we have learned and what remains forever beyond our grasp. The facts of the case are straightforward and not in dispute. Owen Parfitt was an elderly paralyzed man living with his sister Susanna in Shepton Mallet, Somerset, England. On an afternoon in June 1763, while sitting in a chair outside his cottage, he vanished during a span of approximately 15 minutes while Susanna was inside. Despite extensive searches, investigation by local authorities, and more than 2.5 centuries of subsequent interest, no trace of Owen has ever been found. His fate remains unknown. These are the facts we can state with confidence. Everything beyond them is speculation, theory, possibility. We have examined multiple explanations: criminal abduction, murder, sudden recovery from paralysis, supernatural intervention, natural death followed by concealment. Each theory has some degree of plausibility, but each also has significant problems that prevent it from being a fully satisfying explanation. The absence of witnesses in a populated area, the lack of any physical trace despite thorough searches, the implausibility of some scenarios, the absence of clear motive for others. These factors combine to leave us without a theory that answers all questions without raising new ones. What can we say with absolute certainty? We can say that Owen Parfitt existed. The historical record confirms this. We can say that he disappeared in circumstances that seemed inexplicable to those who witnessed them. We can say that despite earnest efforts to find him or discover what happened, no satisfactory answer emerged then or has emerged since. We can say that the case has fascinated people for more than 2 centuries, generating endless theories and speculation but never definitive resolution. We must also say, importantly, that Owen was a real person who deserves to be remembered as more than just a puzzle. Imagine him before his paralysis, working, living, experiencing the full range of human emotion and activity. Imagine him after paralysis struck, confined, dependent, but still fully human, still possessing consciousness and awareness, still experiencing the world from his limited vantage point. Picture his view from that chair on warm days when Susanna arranged for him to be brought outside, watching village life continue around him, feeling sun on his face. These small pleasures, all that remained of his diminished world. He was not merely a victim or a mystery, but a person with interior life, with thoughts and feelings, with a full existence that was uniquely his own. Susanna, too, deserves recognition as more than a character in a mystery. Picture her devotion to her brother, caring for him year after year, performing the hard physical labor of lifting him, feeding him, tending to his needs. This was not easy or glamorous work. It was demanding, exhausting, endless. It required love or loyalty or both. When Owen disappeared, Susanna lost not only her brother, but also the purpose and structure that had governed her life for years. Whether she was involved in his disappearance or was as mystified as everyone else, she suffered a profound loss that marked the rest of her life. She deserves our sympathy and respect. The villagers of Shepton Mallet experienced the mystery as a disruption to their sense of order and comprehension. Imagine living in a small community where life follows predictable patterns, where you know your neighbors, where the world seems manageable and understandable. Then something happens that cannot be explained, that suggests reality is stranger and more unpredictable than you believed. This would have been deeply unsettling, perhaps frightening. It would have changed how people viewed their village and their security. The mystery had costs beyond Owen's loss itself. It cost people their certainty, their sense that they understood how the world worked. For modern audiences encountering this case, it serves several functions. For some, it is entertainment, an intriguing puzzle to ponder, a story to share with others interested in mysteries. For others, it is a reminder of human cognitive limits, evidence that not everything can be known or explained, regardless of effort or intelligence. For still others, it is a doorway into history, an opportunity to learn about Georgian England, about the lives of ordinary people in that era, about how a different time understood and responded to inexplicable events. All these engagements with the case are valid, provided we remember that real people lived these events and experienced real suffering. The question of whether Owen's disappearance will ever be explained is worth considering. Picture a future researcher discovering new historical documents, letters, diaries, court records that somehow escaped previous notice. Such discoveries do happen. Archives contain surprises that surface decades or centuries after events. Buildings under renovation reveal hidden compartments with forgotten documents. It is theoretically possible that someday someone will find something that casts new light on this case. But honestly, the probability is low. 260 years have passed. Every person who had direct knowledge of the event is long dead. The physical scene has been transformed beyond recognition. The cottage is gone. The lane is paved or covered by modern construction. The landscape barely resembles what it was. Evidence that might have existed in 1763 tracks in dust. Witnesses who chose not to speak. Personal knowledge held privately is lost forever. We have only the fragments that happen to survive, and those fragments are insufficient to construct a complete picture. This is not a failure of investigation or intelligence. It is simply reality. Some things cannot be known because the evidence does not exist or cannot be accessed. We must make peace with this uncertainty, accept that some mysteries will remain mysterious, acknowledge the limits of knowledge without viewing those limits as personal or collective failure. The inability to solve Owen Parfitt's disappearance does not mean we are not clever enough or have not tried hard enough. It means that the information needed to solve it is not available and likely never will be. Does it matter that we do not know what happened to Owen Parfitt? In one sense, no. His disappearance did not change the course of history, does not affect current events, does not require urgent resolution. It is a historical curiosity, a footnote in the records of Georgian England, nothing more in the grand scheme of human affairs. But in another sense, perhaps it does matter. Every unsolved mystery represents a gap in our understanding, a reminder that the past is not fully accessible, that human lives contain dimensions we cannot reconstruct or comprehend. Caring about these mysteries, treating them seriously and respectfully, is a way of honoring the people involved and acknowledging that their experiences mattered, even if we cannot fully understand them. Owen Parfitt sat in a chair outside his sister's cottage on a June afternoon in 1763. The sun was warm, the village was busy with ordinary life. Susanna was inside attending to household tasks. Then, in a span of perhaps 15 minutes, Owen was no longer in that chair. He was never seen again, never found, never explained. This is what we know with certainty. Everything else, how it happened, why it happened, where Owen went, remains speculation and possibility. We have theories but not truth. We have questions but not answers. We have mystery. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps even the value of cases like Owen Parfitt's lies not in their solution but in their persistence as unsolved. They keep us humble, keep us aware that we do not possess all answers, keep us engaged with the past as something dynamic and still full of questions rather than static and fully mapped. They give us stories to tell, puzzles to ponder, connections to people long dead through shared wonder at the inexplicable. They remind us that for all our technology and knowledge, the world still contains genuine mystery. Picture the chair where Owen sat, symbolically empty now for more than 2.5 centuries. Picture Susanna emerging from the cottage to find that emptiness, her confusion transforming into alarm and then grief. Picture the villagers searching, the constable investigating, the mystery settling over Shepton Mallet and never lifting. Picture generations hearing the story, proposing theories, coming up empty. Picture yourself now, reading or hearing about Owen Parfitt in the 21st century, separated from the event by vast expanses of time, yet still able to feel the mystery's pull, still compelled by the fundamental impossibility at its heart. Owen Parfitt existed. He lived. He suffered. He vanished. We remember him not for anything he accomplished, but for what happened to him, for the questions his disappearance poses that we cannot answer. In a world that often feels completely mapped and explained, where mysteries yield to forensic science and technology, where the unknown shrinks daily before advancing knowledge, cases like Owen's remind us that mystery endures. Some questions remain unanswered not because we lack cleverness, but because the answers are genuinely beyond our reach. This realization should inspire not despair, but perhaps a kind of wonder. The world is stranger than we fully comprehend. Life contains dimensions that defy explanation. Human experience exceeds our ability to categorize and understand it completely. Owen Parfitt, through his impossible disappearance, teaches us humility before the unknown, acceptance of uncertainty when certainty is not possible, respect for mystery as a legitimate and permanent category of human experience. So we leave Owen where we found him, gone, unexplained, part of history and legend both, real yet ultimately unknowable. The chair is empty, the mystery endures, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Until next time, rest well. Good night.